Okay, so I would like to welcome you to this symposium. We're very excited, as you know, for those of us who work in the human rights and environment, is a very exciting time with the recent recognition of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment by the UN General Assembly. And as we also know, this recognition builds in decades of work by people at many different levels, from the local to the global. And specific instruments that preceded these resolutions, such as the San Salvador Protocol, the Escazú Agreement in Latin America. We can see also in terms of the African system, or the Declaration on Human Rights in terms of Southeast Asia. So it's a significant amount of and wealth of instruments of advocacy by a wide range of people. And despite this, we see also challenges, of course, in terms of especially compliance and implementation, and the realization, actually, of this right to a healthy environment. So how can we imagine this right to a healthy environment making a real difference if we think about biodiversity and healthy ecosystems, climate adaptation and mitigation, disaster risk reduction, including related displacement? So we see that, I mean, in many ways, it is making a significant difference, but yet we are in the midst of this triple crisis of biodiversity, climate change, pollution. So some of the issues that we were discussing when we were putting this dialogue together, the symposium, was how do we think of the right to a healthy environment having an impact in these multilateral environmental agreements, the Convention of Biological Diversity, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, including their review and reporting mechanisms, and truly weave that with advances in international human rights law. And at the same time, how can judges working at the national level, national governments, local governments, municipalities, academics, really engage in this co-production of knowledge and action to make a significant change? So in setting the scene, what we would like to see is this downstream process on international resolutions at the General Assemblies, such as this recognition of the right to a healthy environment, really trickling down and really making a difference at the regional, national level. But importantly, and that's something that we will also like to discuss with all of you, how can we also catalyze this upstream process in which we learn from local communities working at the grassroots level. We learn about indigenous people, local communities from the global south, and how can these really contribute to these cascading effects of the right to a healthy environment. So I would like to leave it like that in terms of setting the scene. We have a very exciting 2 panels. So now I will pass over to the co-moderator of this session. Andrea, the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much. So you've just heard some introductory thoughts from my colleague Claudia Duarte Lima from the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Lund, Sweden. And my name is Andrea Schapper. I'm a professor in international politics at the University of Stirling. And we have co-organized this event together because we were both aware that, you know, so many different actors actually supported the process of recognizing the right to a healthy environment. And in this event, we are particularly interested in learning more about the various actors that made recognition possible, and also the different roles these actors took in the process. So we are particularly interested in exploring the role of the Right to a Healthy Environment Coalition, so the civil society organizations behind the process, and also the role of UN institutions in the process. So we will hear the perspectives and reflections of those civil society actors and representatives of UN institutions who have been part of the process. And we also want to hear more from actors of the Global South, what the recognition of the right to a healthy environment actually will mean for their future work. So the objective of this event is to open a dialogue space where the various actors reflect on the process leading to this landmark resolution in the UN General Assembly and also the recognition in the Human Rights Council. And we also want to discuss new avenues for civil society groups and others working at the grassroots, national and global levels to shape environmental and human rights law and policy in the future. We have structured the event into 2 parts. So in the first part, we will hear from Chiara Ligori from Amnesty International, Kristen Cordero from the Children's Environmental Rights Initiative, and Benjamin Schachter from the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, how the process of recognizing the right to a healthy environment evolved in the Human Rights Council and in the UN General Assembly. And this part will be moderated by me. And then in the second part, we will hear from Astrid Puentes, who is an independent consultant on human rights, climate, and the environment, from Robert Kibugi from the University of Nairobi, Tuti Alawiya, who is the Deputy Director of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute and the Regional Asia Pacific Office in Jakarta, and Su-Young Wang, who is working with the UN Environment Programme. And they will give us some reflections on what the recognition of this right means in practice and in which way it actually opens new avenues for shaping environmental and human rights law and policy in the future. And this part will be moderated by Claudia. So we have asked each speaker to prepare an input for about 5 minutes. And after we've heard from all speakers, we will move into a discussion among the panelists, and we have some questions prepared for them. And then after that, we will open the floor for discussion to the wider audience, and we will ask all of you who are participating today to ask questions and also to contribute your own experience, your own important examples or case studies from your own work. So welcome everyone, and we will now move into the first part and the input that our speakers have prepared. And I would like Chiara to come in first and tell us, Chiara, how was the Right to a Healthy Environment Coalition, the coalition of civil society actors who were strongly involved in the process, in the recognition process, how was that coalition initiated? Chiara.
Thank you so much, Andrea and Claudia and all the others. So yeah, I think first of all I would like to say that my memory only goes back to maybe around 4 years ago when I started to get involved into this conversation. But just to acknowledge that this work has been going on for many more years, as you also acknowledged, by different actors at different levels. So, and especially those who have experienced, violations of the right to a healthy environment directly. So having said that, I wanted to also give a brief overview of this past 4 years, and especially how this coalition came into place. I think it's important to remember the important role played by the UN Special Rapporteur on Environment and Human Rights. First, John Knox, and then David Boyd. And I think a crucial moment to galvanize this process was when they presented the joint report, which was between the end of the mandate of John Knox and the beginning of David mandates, and it was the framework principles on the environment and human rights. And then in that, they seeded the idea for the global recognition of the right to a healthy environment and to the UN General Assembly. And that was actually the moment when David Boyd took the initiative, because it was at the beginning of his mandate. He convened a few organizations from around the world in New York to have a consultation on how we actually make it happen. How do we achieve the global recognition of the right to a healthy environment? But at the same time, there was also the awareness that that group was not super representative because it was mostly from the global north, big organizations, and so we needed to, become more inclusive and expand the coalition. And then I think another key moment was in 2020 when the core group, so the states that were kind of leading this process of recognizing the right to health environment at the UN, so which were Slovenia, Morocco, Switzerland, Maldives, and Costa Rica. So in 2020, they kind of signaled their intention to move forward with this process. And so that was kind of the moment when different organizations came together and we started having regular meetings. And again, there was an effort to try to reach out to different constituencies to make that coalition a bit more inclusive than what was at the beginning. And another key moment then, stemming from those efforts, we managed to have a very important joint call to the Human Rights Council that was drafted by a subgroup, but then opened up for consultation and inputs to the whole coalition that had been formed. And that managed to get around, after, not immediately already had hundreds of signatures from organizations, but at the end, it achieved more than 1,350 signatures, which was an impressive show of coalition, of strength of the call, and also how broad and wide and diverse the support was. And so since then, the coalition has remained in place, but mostly we've been using this joint call as a key reference document and to kind of build our advocacy on that, because that was the key tool that enabled the civil society work and at others level as well. It gave a lot of recognition and legitimacy. I'm going to stop here, but I am happy to take any specific questions later.
Thank you very much, Chiara. That was very, very detailed and very interesting. What we will do, we will go through the speakers first, so everyone can provide their input, and then we have some questions prepared for the panelists, and then we will open to the wider audience so that everyone can ask questions. So if you have a question for Chiara, please just take a note of it, and we'll make sure that you can ask Chiara later on. Thank you very much for your input, Chiara, and we will now move on to Kristen Cordero. She's with the Children's Environmental Rights Initiative, and Kristen will give us an input on the strategies that the Right to a Healthy Environment Coalition use. So which key strategies did the coalition rely on? Kristen, please.
Yeah, and so thank you also for the opportunity to be sharing about the work of the Right to Healthy Environment Coalition, and thanks to everyone who was a part of that moment. So we had a lot of strategies, but I think if I'm going to pick the key ones, I'm going to share with you 3 today. So the first is unified, inclusive, and positive messaging. We wanted to ensure whatever message we put out, any organization with any kind of agenda would be able to share this message. So a child rights organization, a women's rights organization, global, based in Zambia. And we also wanted to make sure that when we shared this message, it was a united front. We thought it was really important that one organization wouldn't shine. It's that we were all together. We were a united force of organizations putting out this one consistent key message. The second strategy was creating actions for the coalition, but also for the public ahead of key moments, and providing them with tools to participate in these actions. So one action was mentioned by Chiara, the global call, inviting civil society organizations to sign on. And another that was, I think, also really successful was a tweet storm that we had during the 46th Human Rights Council session. And essentially the landscape there was that the 5 member states that were championing the right to a healthy environment were planning to put out a statement calling for the right to a healthy environment and inviting governments to co-sponsor this statement. And their aim was to have at least 40 co-sponsorships. So we capitalized on this moment and we asked people to push out messages as much as possible, our key message online, and ahead of the Human Rights Council session. And we provided them with a social media pack, which included social media, sample messages and handles of their Human Rights Council members. And it was actually quite successful. In one day, we had over 4,000 messages. It was trending across the world, including in Switzerland and Zimbabwe. We had high-level support from the chief of UNICEF, from the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights. And most importantly, we were able to not only achieve, but exceed our goal. So at the end of the session, 69 governments had co-sponsored that statement. So creating these really big public moments ahead of really critical times and giving people the tools to easily participate, I think was really an important strategy. Now, the final strategy is creating allies and not enemies. So we either shared information with, collaborated with, or brought visibility to the great steps that other stakeholders took, including stakeholders that we may not traditionally work with in the environmental movement. So these stakeholders are governments, business, the UN, and you'll hear more about the UN soon. But an example of how business supported this campaign was that they put out a statement calling for the right to a healthy environment with 50 signatures from businesses and business coalitions. And they also did one-to-one lobbying with governments. So each stakeholder was really able to use their own unique powers and influences within this campaign and this movement. So yeah, I think those are kind of, again, we had a lot of really important strategies and tactics that we took, but these are the three that come to mind.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Really interesting also how you involved diverse actors, and also very interesting that you're mentioning the business actors as well. That's really something special, I think, to have them on board, and can be quite convincing for the governments. You also mentioned the role of UN institutions, and we have invited Benjamin Schachter from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Ben, if you could maybe tell us a little bit more on how the OHCHR actually supported the process of recognizing the right to healthy environment. Ben, please.
Sure. Thank you very much, and thank you to the colleagues who preceded me. And one of them already mentioned the role of the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment, and so I'll maybe start there and saying that the office supports the mandate of the Special Rapporteur and supported the work carried out by the Special Rapporteur and the originally the independent expert over the past years. And I think that provided an important basis for further work and advocacy directly by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights under the mandate of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And so I'll speak to that a little bit further, and saying, first of all, that we've been engaged with and working to advance the human right to a healthy environment for many years. It's a multi-level effort. So we're going to talk about the global or universal recognition by the Council and the General Assembly, but I think it's really important to emphasize that was made possible by changes at national and regional level, or not made possible, but supported by changes at the national and regional level that have occurred over the course of many years, right? So recognition through national and regional laws and policies and treaties of the right to a healthy environment provided the basis for universal recognition. And so I'd say one of the key developments in recent years was adoption of the Escazú Agreement and its entry into force, regional agreement in Latin America and the Caribbean, the R2HE Convention, a number of states adding or adopting laws, policies, or making constitutional changes to recognize the right to a healthy environment, all contributing to this process, all with support from various UN institutions. With respect to the push for universal recognition, I think a key moment was in 2019 when OHCHR and UNEP signed a memorandum of understanding and issued a press release from the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Executive Director of UNEP calling for universal recognition of the human right to a healthy environment. And this was followed by additional UN principles calling for recognition of the right to a healthy environment, the inclusion of specific language on advancing the right to a healthy environment in the Secretary General's call to action for human rights, the establishment of a couple of interagency mechanisms for UN collaboration on the right to a healthy environment. Excuse me, I'll mention two of those. One is a mechanism to advance the interagency collaboration under the Secretary General's call to action for human rights, which is co-chaired by OHCHR, UNEP, and UNDP. The other is a mechanism, an issue management group under the UN Environment Management Group on Human Rights and Environment, which is also co-chaired by OHCHR, UNEP, and UNDP. So these new mechanisms for interagency collaboration facilitated more and more UN advocacy and support for recognition of the human right to a healthy environment. At HRC 46, so the 46th session of the Council, 15 UN agencies issued a joint statement calling for universal recognition of the right to a healthy environment. The High Commissioner for Human Rights, I think, played a really important role too, in the sense that at HRC 42 and again at HRC 48, she dedicated her global update to environmental issues and environment and climate change. And at HRC 48 made a really powerful case for recognition of the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And it was indeed at HRC 48 that the core group tabled their resolution, HRC 48/13, which recognized the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. In the lead up, there were a few specific things. I mean, you've heard already about the coordination and advocacy that was facilitated by civil society organizations, by the Right to a Healthy Environment Working Group. OHCHR participated and contributed to a lot of these discussions, worked closely also with Indigenous peoples representative organizations as well, and with the core group of member states. And another, I think, key action was to facilitate spaces for exchange between different stakeholders. So OHCHR, UNEP, and others organized a number of activities and expert group meetings, often with and directly in collaboration with the core group of member states, to sort of build awareness and build a foundation for the next step, which was the HRC resolution. Following the HRC resolution, there was an effort to conduct similar work in New York and in the context of the UNGA. So expert meetings and workshops, direct engagement with member states. There was also an effort to take the HRC resolution and socialize it in a variety of different spaces. So the Commission on Status of Women, which focused on environmental issues last year, earlier this year, and the Stockholm Plus 50 discussions and negotiations of CBD and UNFCCC. These were all spaces where the right to a healthy environment could be further socialized, and I think discussions of it and of the HRC resolution in that context helped when it eventually came before the GA. And yeah, then of course the GA resolution, we all saw and are very happy with the results and outcome there. The UN system coordinated very much around both supporting the negotiations and the process leading to adoption of the resolution, but also communicating relative to its outputs or relative to its adoption. And you know, the Executive Office of the Secretary General, OHCHR, UNEP, UNDP, and many others were all out and ready to communicate effectively on what had happened, which was a wonderful historic accomplishment that I think many of you joining us here are contributors to, and looking forward to discussing this further with all of you. Over.
Thank you very much, Ben. That was very detailed and very, very interesting. And yes, we will now move into the part where we will reflect a little bit on what this recognition actually means. And I will hand over to Claudia for moderating this part.
Well, hello again. So it's very exciting to hear what was done prior to this recognition of the right to a healthy environment in the General Assembly, both the strategies that, I mean, people have been doing for a long time, but also innovations in terms of, for instance, this global call, this positive messaging, how to use social media in terms of also engaging more with youth and children, and also these allies that crisscross across, I mean, in terms of countries, but also institutions, and the crucial role of UN also in this process. So now we would go and as part of this reflection, we sometimes feel that in UN processes and in governmental processes as well, we're running a lot. And sometimes it's good to take a pause and sit down and reflect once gaining such a great achievement as the UN resolution of the right to a healthy environment. So a critical moment to think about then what's next. So as part of this reflective process, I would like to ask Astrid. Andrea already presented our speakers, so I won't go into the presentation again, but all of our speakers have amazing experiences. You can go to the website and we have a more detailed bio there, but just to highlight that there's a great panel with very complementary experiences. So to Astrid, how did civil society from the Global South perceive this collaboration with partners from the Global North? If you can share some of your experience on that. Astrid, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Claudia and Andrea and everyone that is organizing this a very important event. As Claudia mentioned, sometimes, especially in these moments of time that we're living, we're just running from one emergency or one important thing to another one, and it's very important to stop and reflect. And so the first thing to say, of course, is that I am an attorney a Colombian based in Mexico City, and I've been working for a long time in this. So I will share my experience from the civil society perspective. And of course, I'm not all these perspectives or not even from the global South. And I think that one of these key aspects of this process is that as you have heard, it's very complex, and to achieve a resolution like this, especially in today's moment with a lot of political scenarios where several actors are behind this and supporting the right to a healthy environment and its recognition, and there's other states that are not, and so overcoming that was a big challenge. And I think that one of the aspect that really helped this coalition is that we understood, everybody, both in Geneva, New York, and the global South and the global North, that this was actually global. So it was not only in the words, but in the practice, we saw that this process transcended and was over Geneva and New York. And at the same time, and because of this, it was important that actors everywhere, first of all, were aware that this was happening, because sometimes processes at the UN are so complicated and really far from the ground. But in this case, it was, as you were listening to, it was from the UN, but a lot of organizations and movements and the special rapporteurs also were seeing the importance of the recognition of the right to health and environment, also linked, and because of the information that they were getting from the ground and from communities. And so that was something that was key, that it was not for a lot of us, or actually for the coalition, it was not a resolution just passed because it was a process. It was a tool, and it is a tool, and it will be effective as much as we use it. And so one of the challenges in collaborating here is that when we have these global perspectives and processes, there's a very different expertise and capacities. And so there's people that are absolutely expert in all steps at the UN, etc., which is very complicated. And then others who are contributing from the ground, or the situations, or even the political perspective of how we can advance to convince government. And that is one of the things that was key. Another thing is, and I saw one of the questions here about gender issues and youth. One of the things, as it was already said by Kristen and Chiara and Ben also, is that it was not easy, but we really made an effort to include people from every areas. One of the challenges that we know that we have both at the UN, but also in civil society organizations and government, is that working to protect the environment and human rights sometimes is constantly is done in silos. And that also happens in movements. And so one of the key things, as Kristen was mentioning, is to make sure that the messages were developed considering different perspectives and interests, and that was not easy. One of the things that was done, for example, is that writing the global call, that letter that Chiara was mentioning, we did it in, I think it was maybe 10 people working on writing that text. But then I can't even know how many other people edited the text. And we were looking at it with the eyes in English, Spanish, French, Arab, Portuguese, as far as I remember. So it was not only a language and wording thing, it was to make sure that everything that mattered from different spaces for the youth, for women, it was there. And we had a lot of pushbacks, or some pushbacks from some people to say, well, if it's human rights, everybody's included. If we say that it's inclusive, it is there. But we have to, and that's one of the things about being included as opposed to exclusion, is that if we're not mentioned, then a lot of communities feel that they're not there, which language is the beginning of inclusion, and that's one of the key parts. So that was key in this process. And Language, of course, means that with meetings in general, sometimes global meetings are always in English, which of course is easy because it's a language where a lot of us can relate to, but that's not the same in a lot of other regions. And so making sure that the communications and even meetings were translated or we had interpretation was absolutely key, because in Latin America, for example, or in Africa or in Asia, there's a lot of people that can contribute so much, but they can't if it's in English. So all of these things that we have been talking a lot about, and so thinking that translation and interpretation is not a cost or a luxury, is a must. And that is something that took a lot of effort, but we managed to do it mostly. Not everything and not every meeting was perfect, and the coalition was not perfect, but that was key. Another thing that I think that was important in terms of Global North and Global South is that we were not shy about highlighting privileges and differences, and important to include other voices, which mean that we had a lot of uncomfortable conversations, which was fine and which was good, because as Kristen also said, one of the key things about this is that communications was done in general, actually communications and all the material was unbranded. And that was not popular, that was not easy. And that is something that is out of the, even sometimes what we are maybe used to, and even foundations don't like that. And so that is something that was very important, really collaborating. And the last point I have, of course, there's several things, but one of the last things that I really want to highlight as well is that I want to highlight the feminist perspective in the process. There were a lot of women in the process, both in civil society organizations, at the UN, in governments. Many of the ambassadors in Geneva and in New York are women. And that is something that we don't necessarily highlight. And that was something that was key, because, and I'm not saying that it's only women, I mean, we have a lot of men participating and highlighting collaboration over competition. If that was, I mean, that was absolutely key in the whole process, just to have this recognition that everybody could implement and contribute. And as many of us said, from Latin America and Africa, especially where this right has been already more developed, is that we wanted to have this as a gift to the world from the South, because most constitutions in the North are the ones, and in Europe haven't recognized the right. And so we wanted to advance this. And so it's great to see. And of course, the challenge and the task now is to implement it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Astrid. I think this idea of bringing both convergence and divergence to the table is what often really creates these constructive innovations that we can see, not remain in the status quo, but really bring different people, or that not necessarily met before, or try to different language. And I mean, we would have loved to have this conversation. We thought about it in terms of having it translating into different languages. We haven't been able to do this in this time, but in terms of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, for instance, we produced a report that was translated to several Southeast Asian languages, specifically trying to understand the innovations and what is happening in Southeast Asia. And we look forward to continuing this dialogue. So now I would like to ask Robert Kibugi from University of Nairobi. We had a great dialogue a couple of years ago when we were discussing how to integrate the right to a healthy environment to the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and can't imagine that we're now just about to start in a few weeks the Conference of the Parties. So it's really timely to now discuss what leverage points can be used for transforming really these United Nations General Assembly resolution recognizing the right to a healthy environment, to safeguard biodiversity, healthy ecosystems, who after all underpin the realization of the right to a healthy environment. So Robert, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Claudia, and good afternoon, good evening to all of you. My apologies for joining a little bit late. Indeed, Claudia, I remember, if you might recall, in Sharm el-Sheikh, when just convincing state parties to contemplate the idea of a human right to a clean and healthy environment as part of the post-2020 biodiversity framework was very difficult indeed, and here we have come. I am a Kenyan lawyer and I teach at the University of Nairobi Law Faculty. And my viewpoints on these, on the leverage points, are from the perspective of an academic involved in teaching, as well as advisory to governments and various other bodies within the region. And I would like to just address three broad points that I think would help. I think, as you may know, African countries generally within the framework of second and third generation constitutions have led the pack over the years in enacting human right to a clean and healthy environment. So indeed, these rights have been in the constitutions or in statutes in various forms. And some countries have now, like Uganda, moved on to the human right to nature, for example, which is a step further. And yet, like most of the world, we contend with challenges that result from the contestation between the environment and its protection on the one hand, and social and economic activities and political priorities on the other hand, with the outcome that most of the time, the environment and by extension, human health, because of instances like pollution, as well as degradation and contribution to the triple crisis, are usually the casualties in this. And so when Claudia asked me to speak about leveraging points, I thought to move away from the grand conversation a little bit and think in terms of my experience, what would be the options available to a minister responsible for environment, for example, or a member of a civil society that would like to advocate, or a judge of a court, for example, within countries in sub-Saharan Africa, seeking to ensure to get leverage from this new global recognition of the human right to a clean and healthy environment. And I would begin in a fairly academic approach. First of all, I think there is a need for us to now unbundle what we mean by the human right to a clean and healthy environment. I believe we have a fairly good understanding of the idea of the human right itself, the entitlement. The notion of a human right is well established from the era of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the much well-established development of socioeconomic rights over the years, as well as civil and political rights. The problem is on the second part of that right, what you are entitled to, the clean and healthy environment. And at some point, I remember when I was teaching a university graduate class, and I said to them, the problem that the human right to a clean and healthy environment often faces is that if you look at the country's national development plan or plans, most of the key actions that are proposed are actually drivers to degradation of a clean and healthy environment. And so you have to contend, if it is development of infrastructure, the government of Kenya just abandoned a plan to build a highway through the Aberdares National Park, a key water tower and catchment for the city of Nairobi, and about 5 million people, for instance. In my view, a clean and healthy environment would generally amount to an environment whose components are able to reasonably and holistically provide a variety of ecosystem services of the three kinds that we know: regulating, which, as you know, are also pertinent to reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, as well as provisioning, which are key to food, supporting, which are very pertinent to things like restoration of soil, as well as aesthetic or cultural. If we can identify more specifically which of the ecosystem services are at risk when they interact with the various economic and political priorities, then we begin to understand from an actionable perspective at governmental point or civil society point on what to do. Very quickly, let me give you an example. In any government, there is always a ministry responsible for agriculture, agricultural production, or something akin to that. One of the most common policy priorities of public expenditure is the use of fertilizers, mineral fertilizers, the use of pesticides, acaricides, the use of and various such things, which have got devastating effect not only on the environment but also on human health. And so, if we understand how these activities, although advancing agriculture productivity, are going to harm the ability to meet, to fulfill the human right to a clean and healthy environment, perhaps we can begin to understand that we are basically giving with one hand and taking with the other, and engaging in a fairly self-defeatist undertaking, pursuing economic actions, but on the other hand, harming ourselves, because the pollution that goes into the water, etc., is something we need to do. So we do need to have a conversation about how to meaningfully and in a non-technical manner begin to unbundle the second component of what this human right to a clean and healthy environment is guaranteeing, and how these can actually fit, for example, in development plans, priorities for countries and governments across the world. The second point is that it's important that for purposes of citizens and civil society to leverage on the much more developed civil and political rights across the country. In terms of the rights of participation, in terms of the rights of demonstration, in terms of the freedom of expression, in terms of freedom of assembly, etc. It's quite important that we continue devising strategies over how, in order to further advance, because a more nuanced and developed human right to a clean and healthy environment, as I've just indicated, will challenge the economic status quo, the political status quo, in more ways than we know it. And there is need for better systems of organizing, of protecting human rights defenders by leveraging on civil and political rights, including judicial systems for our benefit. And the third point is in terms of strategic partnerships, and this is my final point, strategic partnerships and collaborations. And here, I think that countries and people within countries, whether in civil society, academia, or elsewhere, should leverage outwardly, but also horizontally. Let me begin with horizontal linkages and collaboration. There is a need for us to have more peer level partnerships amongst countries that are contiguous or within the same regions. I am from Kenya, and there is a need for both governmental institutions, but also citizens, academics, civil society to learn from each other and to observe, so that you can see what good others are doing and you can see what bad they are doing. And also, for example, in regions or countries where civil and political rights may be of a lesser scale, perhaps others learning about their challenges with respect to a clean and healthy environment could help with resolving that second challenge. But importantly, we are living in the era of regional economic communities, which also often embrace free movement among other aspects, which means that it's important to learn from each other at all levels, whether in government, academia, civil society, private sector. And finally, from the global perspective, I think we have, of course, seen, for example, the momentum of this human right increase because of the role of the United Nations and other agencies, or as we are having this conversation today, or even the role of the Human Rights Commission in developing the normative elements of these rights. And many countries, including my own, have constitutional provisions that allow courts as well as executive branches to apply principles of international law in terms of implementation and application of the law. So the development of international law, as we are discussing to do with respect to the human right to a clean and healthy environment, is not an exercise in futility. In fact, it's quite important, but the attention of its value needs to be brought to the attention of more people, particularly those involved in policy making, judicial decisions, as well as those in civil society who often do peer and shadow accountability. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robert Kibugi. You gave us a very rich example and very concrete evidence of the issues that are needed to be taken into account to make this right to a healthy environment really have impacts in people's lives. And I think this idea of horizontal vertical collaboration is really interesting. And I mean, I could say that not only countries that are close together, we see that happening, for instance, in terms of what Ben also mentioned, the Escazú Agreement on Information, Participation, Access to Justice in environmental issues in Latin America and the Caribbean. As you remember, we had even a Conference of the Parties side event on the context of the Convention of Biological Diversity, where African scholars were discussing the Escazú Agreement. And we have had these very interesting interactions cross-regionally, South-South collaboration, and yeah, really interesting food for thought. So now I will pass on the word to Dr. Tuti Alawaya, who is Deputy Director of the Asia and Pacific program in terms of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. So Dr. Tuti, the floor is yours.
Okay. First, thank you very much, Claudia, for the opportunity to discuss with you all on this right to healthy environment. First, I would like to say that it's very fascinating to learn from all of you on how actually things evolving and how actors across countries and various diverse stakeholders, including government and civil society organization, have worked together to successfully have this right to healthy environment recognized by the UN Assembly. So I just want to probably share my thought on first, like Raoul Wallenberg Institute. I don't know if Claudia have shared this with you all, but in 2019, we did a study on 10 countries study on disaster displacement, and we created an academic network across Asia Pacific. And at that time in 2020, in 2020, we wrote a statement to the special rapporteur on the importance of this right to healthy environment. That's as a background. Actually, when that happened, I haven't started working with the RWI. So Claudia is the best person who actually tell you about that story from Raoul Wallenberg Institute, Asia Pacific. So actually, I would like to address Claudia's question on what strategies communities in especially Southeast Asia or Asia in general, how we can, what is the next step after this? Maybe from,
well, Tuti,
oh,
just
yeah?
sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I forgot, I think for everyone, we shared the questions beforehand, but also the important role of women from the
Yes.
Global South that, I mean, Tuti, you have so much experience on that, and that will really complement in terms of the other presentations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia. So I think when it comes to how we actually implement right to healthy environment, especially in Asia and Southeast Asia and Indonesia, particularly where I'm from, there are actually several issues and challenges. Maybe before we go to the strategies, first, like it was mentioned by one of the speaker, I think from Mexico, if not Astrid, sorry. So actually the language is one of the barrier for many Southeast Asian countries who probably could not access English. So that's probably when we talk about promotion and socialization to the communities, there are many UN treaties need to be translated into, for instance, Indonesian language, Thai language, and other languages. The second one is actually, while we talk about environmental issue here, like in many developing countries, people still struggling with other critical issues, including gender inequality. So for instance, women in Indonesia are still facing, let's say, lack of education, underemployment, inadequate housing. Those type of thing is still critical for people to address. So in the last, actually, I think decade, people just started to talk about climate justice, talk about how to integrate healthy environment in our everyday life. So in that regard, actually, I would like to probably give you some examples how many communities in Indonesia, especially women, because many women in many countries like Indonesia engaged and involved in many social organizations, both that like community-based grassroots organization, as well as like government-affiliated social agencies. So they utilize this civil society organization as an avenue for them to leverage the environmental issues. So one of the example is the movement that actually happening currently in Indonesia is how people actually doing household waste management. People started to planting trees. People started to talk about how we actually can reduce emission, use public transportation. But actually, that's actually started very recently in Indonesia. So we actually still need to do a lot on promotion and socialization in the community, and often women and community organization used by the government to actually promote this right to healthy environment. In the justice sector, what happened is actually we do have environmental law. However, the implementation of the law and how that actually implemented in the court by the justice sector, by judges, is actually very slow. So many environmental cases actually cannot be addressed appropriately by the judges because lack of, let's say, knowledge about the environmental law, etc. So one of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute work is actually on the justice sector and how to influence the court system, the justice, and the, let's say, prosecutors to work and help those, let's say, environmental defenders cases against the corporate. Another challenge is actually industrializations. As we all may know, actually, while we are working on keeping our planet green, at the same time we need to, our economic, we need to feed people. That's actually the crucial issue here. So talking about industrialization, talking about economic development, that still become the priority of the government. So while the government of Indonesia or many countries in Asia has their commitment to for the NDC to make this commitment by the 2050, let's say, net zero emission, but there are a lot of challenges faced by our government. Therefore, I think the role of civil society organization is actually, in one hand, actually working with communities, with women, to provide services, to help with the environmental issues. At the same time, they help the government, hold the government accountable and give pressure to government to implement the laws and regulation, especially on rights to healthy environment. When it is recognized by the UN Assembly, I think it gives a more ammunition for the people as well as the community and civil society organization across the countries to work collaboratively with communities as well as with the government. Other things, I think probably one of the thing that big critic on this is actually from the feminist perspective. One of them is, as we all know, probably Vandana Shiva is a feminist ecologist who actually worked tirelessly on to ensure that women from the global south or from Asia have the voice, and she actually tirelessly protest on how the corporate and industrialization have worked to exploited the environment and other things. That's probably the thing that in the Southeast Asia, knowing someone like Vandana Shiva is important, because to us, like we are related to like country like India on how to tackle poverty at the same time, but also we also need to tackle environmental issues. I think that's probably all, Claudia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think this idea of interaction between state-led initiatives and right holder-led initiatives, and this idea of women's groups helping to hold accountable states as well. And I think when you bring Vandana Shiva, I just got to think about how she clearly expressed how thinking about this diversity of life on Earth and engaging in ecosystem services, that was something that also Robert brought. It's not a luxury, but really a survival issue. So I think when it comes to women, this is clear, it's a life or death issue often, especially in the global south, which links very well also to what Astrid was mentioning earlier. So now I would like to give the floor to Dr. Soo-Young Wang. It's great to meet again in these spaces. I feel like I have met so many of you just in different parts of the world. So getting all together here in this symposium, it's just wonderful. So going back to the role of UN and thinking about next steps, now that we have had the perspectives of both civil society organizations, UN. So what do you think, Soo-Young, are the next steps after this recognition of the right to a healthy environment by the UN General Assembly? So Soo-Young, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Claudia, and so nice to see you again, and a lot of people that we've actually working together. We've been working together for many, many years. So it's congratulations again to everybody for the GA resolution recognizing the right to healthy environment. So that's a very, very tough question. Actually, the next steps everybody is asking. So on 28th of July, when after that resolution was adopted, I was in New York for this, and everybody asked like, so what is next? And then I said, I don't know, let me just think about it. Let us just celebrate for a bit. So I think a lot of people were just getting excited, and also like getting used to the fact that like this actually really happened. But I think now is really the time that we have to think about what is the next step, and what can we do, and what are our strengths in going forward, and what are the weaknesses in the way we go forward. But let me just start with I think like some of you actually mentioned about what's happening, how the GA resolution is affecting so many different for us. It's so one is so it may have direct impacts in some cases on the ground, so women's rights, and also at the national level. But at the regional levels, it's having indirect impact in boosting and also the helping the implementation of MEAs and also the regional agreements. So that's the Council of Europe is discussing the additional protocol on the right to healthy environment at the moment. So we don't know yet where this is going, but what we learned is that GA adoption of the resolution is really helping for the Council of Europe to actually to take this agenda forward, because it's been going on for about like last 10 years. And also the EU due diligence legislation, so which is still being negotiated, which and that has a lot of environmental components, and also on the environmental defenders. And the GA recognition is also like really helping to guide this discussion to go in the right direction we want. And also the ESCA's agreement, how this is going to help in how it's going to be implemented in relation to the GA resolution, and also the AUS convention, and also the special rapporteur on environmental defenders appointed by the parties of the AUS convention was also actually quite stimulated by the by the Council resolution which was adopted last year in October by in Geneva. So there are a lot of things happening, and also it's fostering the conversation within the national domestic sphere about how to implement the right, and also whether if you don't have a right in the constitution, whether you can actually have it, and so on. But having said this, so there are a lot of positive developments, direct and indirect. But at the same time, I think going forward, what we really need to work on is have more clarity and have more oxygen to what this right means. So like a lot of questions about scoping, what is the scope of the right, and how do you define environment, and how do you define healthy, and how do you define sustainable, and so on, which is quite well established in some sense by the treaty bodies and so on, but still in the environmental context, what does that mean? So the scoping exercise is really an important thing. And also when we talk to states for the duty bearers who will be actually having the obligation to implement this right, some of them, they really want to know how they can implement this right. But what they say is, you talk about the UN, and we all talk about the rights-based approach to the environment. But when it comes down to the practical level, they say it's really difficult to sell it to their own government, because they really want to know what that means, what they can do, what they should do, and what they should not do. So something more practical, like how it can be implemented on the ground by the governments, but also by the UN country teams and the people working on the ground. So the scoping and the definition and the obligation, clarifying the obligations, and also the implementation, like how it can be implemented. So that's a guidance I think that is really needed, that the UNEP and also the OHCHR and other UN agencies are very much keen on actually working together on this in cooperation with all stakeholders that actually worked with us together. Having said it, so like there's some limitations in comparison to actually the right to water, which was recognized about 12 years ago, 2010. So the big difference between these two is environment is a lot more broad than water. So, and then the implementation challenges come from the scope of the two issues. And also when the water was adopted, the right to water was recognized that had already had a framework, and also quite specifically mentioned in the economic and social rights context. So that's a bit of a challenge. And this is actually really just not about economic social issues, but also civil and political rights issues. So that's a bit of difference, but challenging in a way, but I think that's also opens up a lot of possibilities for us to make things work better for the planet and for the people. And I'll just try to, I will close my presentation and my little conversation with on positive note. So I think reflecting what happened, our long journey of the Council resolution and the GA resolution, I think one thing that really proved is a multi-stakeholder approach in the intergovernmental negotiation, because that does really not happen every day. And civil societies and the young people and children, they're kind of marginalized in a lot of discussions. But for this, so we had a strong support, but also strong engagement of the global civil societies and grassroots organizations, including children and young people, and also businesses. So it's really opened up kind of, I talk about this at my work of other meetings. So we talk about how this actually really helped, how this was a really good example of the multi-stakeholder approach and the new architecture for multilateralism, because the current state-based, state-centered negotiation doesn't really it's not inclusive of the rights holders and the people who matter on this. So, and we had a lot of good political will. So it was adopted by the vote of 161 countries voting in favor, and 8 abstention, and 117 countries co-sponsoring the resolution. And when you compare this record to other rights recognition or other GA resolutions, it's really, really a good record. So that's with a good note. So as we have the support from all societies, parts of the societies, and also the government. So the challenges, I think we'll be able to solve it. And then also it's an exciting actually way ahead for us to towards the implementation of the right. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think this new architecture that you were mentioning of multilateralism, where like right holders are also a key part of that. And I think we're seeing it more and more, for instance, in the context of the Escazú agreement and this constructive interaction between various regional processes that you highlighted, Sejong. That was very insightful. So now I will pass over to Professor Andrea again, so we can start the dialogue with the audience. We see that there are already significant questions here in terms of the chat, what we will bring, but we also want to make this as dynamic as possible. So if people want to also turn on their mics and their cameras, that's also something that we encourage, but please keep it brief so then we can get as many interventions as possible. So I will pass over to Andrea to continue facilitating part of this discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much. I saw that we have had a couple of questions in the chat already, and I saw that some of the questions were already answered there. The first question was actually for Chiara. Chiara unfortunately had to leave already, but if you, I'm just quickly checking who posed this question. If you could just maybe leave your, oh, that's Alois. Alois, if you could leave your email address, I will make sure that this question is being passed on to Chiara. I will send it to her and she will be able to respond to your question. Or I could also pose this question to everyone on the panel. So Alois has asked, based on your experience, where will this right fit best in a global instrument to make it effective? So is there a step to make it legally binding? I think that's probably a question that is very interesting for everyone. Is there anyone on the panel who would like to comment on this? Are there plans for making it a legally binding global instrument?
Soo-young.
Soo-young, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. So as far as I know, I don't think there's any global level movement on this yet. But as I mentioned, the Council of Europe, they're working on the additional protocol to the European Convention on Human Rights, which if they succeed, it will be a legally binding for the Council of Europe members. But at the moment, I'm not aware of any global treaty making process on this right.
Thank you very much, Soo-young. Kristen, you also had to comment on this.
Yes, I wanted to share, although that this wouldn't necessarily encompass all groups, there is a general comment that's going to be coming out next year on children's rights, the environment, and climate change. And all member states who have signed on to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, this would be legally binding for them. And so this tool will actually be really useful for holding accountability of member states in respect to children's right to a healthy environment. So that can be a useful tool.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The particular looking at children's rights in particular, and the developments in that respect, because there are many developments happening. So thank you very much, Kristen. That's a really, really important comment. Astrid, please.
Thank you. So Chiara left a comment in the chat for that question as well. It's very brief, but and this question about the how binding or not is this right? I think that that's something to take very carefully, because so the resolution itself is one conversation, but the human rights are indivisible and interdependent. And there are already, as Kristen mentioned, on the right to children, but there's all other human rights treaties that include human rights that are linked to the human right to healthy environment, as we know. And as I said, human rights are indivisible and interdependent, and the right to healthy environment is one evidence of that. The other point that I want to make is that both at constitutions and regionally, in most of the world, the right to a healthy environment is already binding. And through the link to the right to life and right to integrity and others, it has been already developed even in Europe and in the US and Canada. So the fact that the resolution is not in the procedure binding doesn't mean that the right is not. And so it is already. And I think the task that we have is make sure that we don't have, and this, sorry, I'm touching to another question about development and progress. The implementation of the right needs to move the world forward to the fact that we have to pick between development and jobs or the environment. We don't have to do that. And the crises have evidence that what we call today progress of development is not actually as such, because it is costing human rights and the environment and the planet. And so we need to change that and to make sure that protection of rights or an advancement of some groups or societies are not costing either the planet or the human rights of others. And that is the opportunity that we have today.
Thank you very much, Astrid. Really, really interesting thoughts. I also saw that before Chiara left, she had actually left a reply to Alois' question. And she said, I'm so sorry, I will need to leave soon due to another commitment. Just a quick thought to respond to Alois' question on whether there are plans to have a binding treaty on this right. I don't think so, and I'm not sure it is needed. The right is recognized already in the African and American human rights system. There are discussions on a binding protocol to the European Convention on Human Rights, but even if it doesn't happen, there are already enough tools to use and claim this right. I also think UN treaty bodies can play a role in continuing to defining this right. So this is very consistent with what the other speakers on the panel have actually mentioned. So we have legally binding instruments in several regional human rights systems, and we have the treaty bodies to further define this. So thank you very much, Chiara, for answering this as well before you left. I can see more questions, comments. Axel Eriksson, did you want to ask a question?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm Axel, one of 2 Swedish youth delegates in the UNFCCC. And first of all, thank you to speakers. It was very interesting. So my question is, how can we ensure when consulting about the right to a healthy environment that the diversity of youth are involved? Because I know that, for example, youth from the global north, me being one of them, are usually overrepresented in decision-making fora and so on. And therefore, it's important to ensure a diversity of youth to make sure that, well, not only a small fraction of youth voices are heard, but a more representative fraction. So how do we ensure?
Thank you very much, Axel, for this question. I think it's a really good question. It's a really important question as well. And I think it's a question that touches upon inclusivity. And this was something that many of our speakers have already touched upon or mentioned. Robert, for example, talked about horizontal partnerships. Kristen mentioned inclusive messaging. Chiara said we needed the global call for for taking more actors from various countries and regions on board to ensure inclusivity. Tuti and Astrid mentioned language issues, and you have now mentioned how do we make sure that we include youth from all parts of the world equally. So the inclusivity question, I think it's a really important one. So I would like to ask the panel to comment on this. Robert, please.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea. Before I comment on that, I wanted to respond to that question by Alois also. Yeah. About, and I think the response by Chiara was very useful. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights does have a variant of the right talks about a generally satisfactory and the right to a generally satisfactory environment favorable to development. Based on the current trend, for example, with the African Convention on Natural Resources, having very little in terms of ratification and etc., I doubt there is going to be much appetite for a binding treaty in this respect. I think there might be another way, which is one, to have the African Commission on Peoples and Human Rights issue a general comment linking the right in the charter, which is from the early 80s. The charter is from the early 80s with the new Human General Assembly resolution. And perhaps if that's not satisfactory, the Commission has routinely been taking matters before the African Court of Human and People's Rights for clarification on various positions. That could also help. But I think eventually for me is there needs to be a more dedicated effort to have the elements of this right mainstreamed by governments into areas that matter. We can talk about the normative elements of these rights, but meanwhile, we still have coal operations being approved on community lands and causing pollution, etc. So there is a sense in which the benefits of these rights need to be aimed at economic activities that deliver very little in terms of benefit to people, but cause extensive and long-term environmental pollution and harm and human health harm. Over to the question of inclusivity. I would have thought Axel, being the youth delegate, could have driven us directly into what looks like it's the realm of the youth, social media. It looks to me every time I go on to Twitter, and I'm not on Instagram, so I cannot speak about that. There is always a Twitter space and so many other areas where I can see my students talking about having discussions and holding conversations about this. And it looks to me as if from the various social media pathways, they are very good ways of reaching a lot of youth. And I would say that it doesn't quite matter now whether you are in what we generally refer to as the global north or south. Access to mobile phone telephony is actually much more deeper in my part of the world, and a lot of younger people have a variant of a smartphone. It might not be an iPhone 14, but they have a variant of a smartphone that makes it possible for them to do that, because they will not read government circulars, they won't read policy briefs, they certainly will not read a general comment unless it's for a class assignment or a class project, and even whether they read that fully is debatable. My point being that it might be useful to figure out a way to reach young people, the youth, but I'm quite caught on to what Kristen is talking about, the role of children, because I think that's an even more important constituency to reach on to these elements, because of an often something we say as though is mundane, but when our children talk to us about some of these things at home, the following morning when you're in a class, in a meeting, in a decision making, it sticks on your head and it might have an impact, but plus their future generations. But over to the point of the youth, I think inclusivity, we should look to medias of engagement that are very compatible with the youth of today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert, for sharing your ideas. I think the idea of using social media is quite an interesting one. And I think that was also used by the Right to Healthy Environment Coalition via the global call, really to reach out to many different organizations and different regions. But then in the end, I mean, the processes were also in Geneva and in New York, and those organizations that had the capacities and resources to be present there played a crucial role there. But I'm interested to hear what Kristen wanted to add to this, since she was also leading the communications team in the Right to a Healthy Environment Coalition. So Kristen, please.
Yeah, so reiterating what others said in terms of inclusivity, reaching out to young people, especially from marginalized communities, language, how you display your materials, is it visuals, there's a lot of considerations, and a lot of people highlighted that. And I think one thing to add that I think is really critical is not just creating platforms for young people, but actually having them be the decision makers in this process of how do we include children and young people in these processes, and having them be the ones who decide how that happens, right? Because you can sit here as an adult and think you know everything, but that's not true. You haven't lived in the shoes and the experiences of children and young people and from these different communities. So I think that's a really essential part as well. And with the general comment that will be on children's rights, the environment, and climate change, one way of doing that is that there's a children's advisory board. So we've selected children from different regions across the world who have networks with children from different, parts of the world, who are really advising us on how do we make this inclusive? How can we get a young person who is in a detention center or a refugee camp? How can they participate in this? Or who doesn't have internet access? So I just wanted to add and complement what other people were saying on that point.
I think that's so important, Kristen, in terms of if we're thinking about the future, think about children and future generations and this decision-making power that it becomes. It's not only a tick box of information participation, but it's participation for decision-making. And we see this creativity again and again, that it's not so stiff as in certain contexts we can see with other terms of generational justice. So Tuti has also something to participate now, and then we will, Andrea and I could wrap up. It's such an interesting dialogue that it's a shame to have to end it now, but we see this as the beginning of a longer process. So Tuti, you have the word.
Yeah, so I think the questions on how to engage youth is very interesting. In our case at the Royal Wallenberg, actually, we asked the youth to lead several activities, including, let's say, they created their own campaign. We asked them to have a workshop to engage youth to talk about environment and come up with recommendation on how to engage youth in the climate change and other global environmental issues. This is actually very powerful. We work with, let's say, ASEAN Youth Forum, and we also work with Youth International that based in India. So that's actually, we want to engage meaningfully, not from our perspective, but from their own perspective, how they want to do it, because they actually the one who have ideas. They're the one who engage closely with the Twitter or Facebook or other social media platform. So I think engaging them directly, that would be probably the best way, while we also, of course, can mainstream youth in all our program. Let's not forget that among youth is actually young professional who will later actually take a lead on what we are doing currently or now. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I think those concrete examples gives you really hope of the variety of things that are happening in various regions. And before we conclude, something that we were thinking in terms of just continuing this conversation, we have received now in the chat some of the key messages that UN organizations, well, various UN agencies have produced. And we know all of you from their different constituencies and different organizations have produced this material. So we were thinking, if you thought that that would be something helpful, we could gather these resources and put them as part of the recording that will be after shared with the participants. And we have also heard from other interventions that they would like to have the key messages or like a synthesis of the discussion made. So we will make sure that that is also done. I would also like to take this opportunity in terms of showing that, I mean, this process is continuing. We're having an event together with University of Nairobi, and Robert is part of the co-organizers, among other partners, on climate justice, grassroots activism, and human rights law that will take place in Nairobi. And also virtually, I will be sending some information on this event, and really just to thank you for this great opportunity to really sit down, reflect openly, both about like the great successes, as somebody was saying, so Young was saying, let's take time to celebrate. I think as human rights lawyers and scholars, and maybe daunted at certain points, but I completely agree. Let's take this opportunity. I hope this reflective space was also an opportunity to celebrate, and this positive messaging that we need, complementary to, of course, acknowledging all the challenges. So from my side, that could be it. I would like to highlight that, I mean, this was a joint organization. Andrea already mentioned some of the organizers at the beginning. We also had the Global Network on Human Rights and Environment co-sponsoring this event. As you know, it's a network of academics, practitioners, and so on. So it's really a momentum that we need to bring, and we look forward to continue doing it. So over to you, Andrea.
Yeah, let me just thank everyone for participating and for joining us today. We will leave the chat open, so if any of the participants would like to share any comments or even case studies, experiences in their own countries, Claudia and I, we will remain on the chat for the next 10-15 minutes, and we will, we're happy to interact with you, hear some more stories, hear more from your experiences. So there will be an interactive part following this webinar. Thank you very much to all the speakers, panelists, for joining us today, for sharing their thoughts and sharing their perspectives, reflections. It was really interesting. For me, a huge learning point was really about inclusivity and about including everyone, so every generation, every part of the world, every language, and what we can really learn from this for future processes, and also including a variety of types of actors, so civil society, UN institutions, but also business actors, for example, youth and so on, UN institution, the special rapporteurs. So this diversity, I think, was a key strength in this process. And diversity and inclusivity are the learning takeaway points for me today. A huge thank you to all the speakers, panelists for joining us today, and all the participants also for asking questions, listening to us. There is a website, and you will receive the recording of this webinar on the website. So if you want to go back and listen to it, you're very welcome to do so. There will be additional resources as well. All the resources that were shared during the session, for example, by Ben, Kristen, and others, other organizations will be there. And like I said, Claudia and I, we will be here on the chat. If you want to share some stories, some case studies, we'll be very happy to learn about your experiences in relation to the right of a healthy environment. Thank you very much. Claudia, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that's great. We will also close now the recording. And yeah, thank you so much to all.